Hey guys, Cryptober here with another video, and I wanted to talk a little bit today about the religious end of Star Wars and George Lucas and what his thoughts were on the whole thing. And there's a big quote that I want to give you guys that kind of is going to be very interesting for a lot of people. Good, bad, indifferent, any way around. But so we all know that when George was a young guy, when he was college aged, he got in a huge car accident, and most people figured he should be dead. And he finds it amazing that he survived, and he felt like he had to do something with his life. And so, like, to some extent, you could argue, like, honestly, almost like a religious experience or what have you. And so he went back to school, finished, got into storytelling, and we'll kind of get into this here with some quotes and stuff, just about what he thinks about religions and different things and all that type of stuff. So one of the things he said in a interview was, "I put the Force into the movies in order to try and awaken a certain kind of spirituality in young people. More a belief in God than a belief in any particular, religious system." I mean, the real question is to ask the question, because if you having enough interest in the mysteries of life to ask the question, is there a God or is there not a God? That's, for me, the worst thing that can happen. If you asked a young person, is there a God? And they say, I don't know, I think you should have an opinion about it. So, obviously this is pretty important to George, that idea of at least contemplating the question and coming up with an answer on your own rather than just saying, I don't know, or I don't care, or whatever. That's pretty cool. And that actually makes sense and would inform a lot of the things that he was doing in the movies and in his storytelling. I think he's right. I think it's a question everybody needs to at least ask themselves, just to sort of leave it open-ended and not ask. I mean, I guess technically, yeah, sure, you don't have to. But I do think that it is good for a person to ask those questions, and I think it's pretty sensible of George to feel this way in terms of how it is when you watch those films. And you can definitely get the sense of a higher power, obviously. And then he was like, when I was 10 years old, I asked my mother, I said, well, if there's only one God, why are there so many religions? And over the years, I've been pondering that question ever since. And it would seem to me that the conclusion that I've come to is that all religions are true. They are just part of the elephant, or they just see a different part of the elephant. So basically, he grew up as a Methodist, which is why I think there's definitely some Christian elements in Star Wars. And sort of one of the biggest things in Star Wars definitely has a Christian element to it, and he verifies that. But basically, he's an omnist, and so basically he believes that all religions contain elements of sort of common truth or potential truths. That's where he's at now, after having grown up a Methodist. But as we'll see later, obviously the Methodist, sort of the Protestant Christian Methodist ideas he grew up with definitely informed something pretty major in Star Wars. And then he says, a religion is basically a container for faith. Faith is the glue that holds us together as a society. That's a pretty major statement. Faith in our culture, faith in our world, whatever it is that we're trying to hang on to, is a very important part of, I think, allowing us to remain stable, remain balanced. So he connects it there to religion, and then how religion is a container for faith. So what it sounds like to me is that he just isn't into sort of the hierarchy of religions and like some of that stuff, but that he's sees them as, like he says, containers for faith, or that faith is sort of the thing that holds everybody together. You think about Yoda, right? He's lifting the X-Wing out of the swamp, and Luke's just dumbfounded, and he goes, I don't believe it. And then, of course, Yoda says, that's why you fail. So right there, you see sort of that broad faith element. And in Star Wars, the religion is the Jedi, right? So there's the faith element, but the religion part of it, or the container for the faith that the Jedi have, is sort of the order and how everything's set up and the rules that they follow. Like only act in self-defense, don't go out of your way to harm people. be peacekeepers, all of those types of things. So he's definitely just bringing in sort of broad elements. I mean, obviously we can point to sort of some specifics, like sort of the Buddhist side of it, the monk aspects, things of that nature, and sort of the pacifism that goes along with a lot of that stuff. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't necessarily see certain religions in there, but there's definitely some of those Eastern philosophies and some of that stuff in there for sure. But the one thing I really wanted to talk about was the Christian element and how it relates to sort of the main character of George's 6 films of the saga. And that is, of course, Darth Vader. And this is a really interesting quote from Howard Kazanjian. And he was a producer of Return of the Jedi and, if I'm not mistaken, Empire as well. So they were shooting Jedi, or they were going through the process of coming up with ideas for Jedi, or whatever they were doing. I shouldn't actually say, because I don't know for sure what point in the timeline they were at, but they were definitely at the point where they were talking about Anakin's redemption and all of that stuff that went along with that. Kazanjian says to George, why this guy, Vader, he's like Hitler. He's killed. He's done all of these terrible things, and now we're saying he's equal with Yoda and Obi-Wan, as if he's gone to heaven or whatever. So they're clearly talking about the Force Ghost scene at the end of Return of the Jedi. And then this is really important here, and I think this is, again, going back to how he was raised, and then and I think it gives insight into the perspective of maybe where George might lean more in terms of religions, because they're not all the same. They don't all preach the exact same thing. So you just kind of wonder, just because if you listen to what he says here. So he says, he's this evil guy. He's done all these terrible things, and now we're going to say he's equal to Yoda and Obi-Wan in death, that he's gone to heaven or whatever. And then George pointed to me. He was real close. So think about that from a body language perspective. So you're standing and you say this to a person, and then they point at you and really closely say, so that gives you an impression that this is something pretty important to this person. And he says, isn't that what your religion is all about? And of course, he's referencing the fact that in Christianity, even somebody who's done really, really bad things, if they truly in their hearts accept Jesus and repent, that they are going to be equal to others that maybe we would view as humans as being better than them. And that's just because in Christianity, everybody's done bad. So, nobody is better than anybody else in terms of how God sees them, I guess, through Jesus or whatever. So he says, isn't that what your religion is all about? While he's pointing at him. And then Kazanjian says, and boy, that was like being slapped in the side of my face, because yes, it is what my religion is all about. And obviously his, of course, I think he's changed maybe since then. Maybe he was sort of very Methodist when he made the original trilogy, but I hadn't thought it through. And that's pretty important, because that's something that people have a hard time with. Not necessarily a lot of people, but there are people out there that have a hard time with this idea that Anakin, after everything he did, just because he saved Luke, all of a sudden he's redeemed, and in death he gets sort of the preferential treatment, or however you want to word it, and that does rub some people the wrong way. It actually, even Kylo, right, in the sequels, right, it rubbed people the wrong way, that all of a sudden he's just this great guy at the end, and how does that work, and look at all the bad things he did, and that's where this is interesting, because in other religions, like, there's certain things you have to do to be, like, worthy. Whereas Christianity, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is the only one that you can never be worthy, that you have to seek Jesus because he's the only worthy one, and he has to kind of, like, whatever, intercede for you. Anyways, I just found that very interesting, and he grew up Methodist, and again, he took it pretty seriously, pointing at the guy and telling him closely, like, hey man, what are you talking about? And calling him out, right, for his beliefs. It's just interesting to talk about. It's an interesting video to make for me, just reading these quotes, and also understanding that. And I know at that time in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot more Christians in Hollywood than there are now. There's whatever ones are in there now certainly aren't being very vocal about it, because that's a career ender. So that's kind of interesting, right? He had all these people around, and his producers were Christians, and then you see that symbolism in the movies. And of course, you do see other stuff as well. Like I said, there's a lot of Eastern philosophy, Buddhism, other things as well. You can't argue that either. But anyway, I just find that interesting. That's how he felt about what he was doing with Anakin Skywalker, who is the main character of the saga. Obviously, Luke's the main character, I would argue, with the OT, but the saga as a whole. So, very cool. I'd like to hear what you guys have to say in the comment section. If you like this content, please like, subscribe. Always helps the channel. Feel free to check anything else on my channel. Have yourselves a very good day.